Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the lives and deaths of Manuel Gómez González and Adílio Daronch in a story I call The Red Dust of Rio Grande. Close your eyes and let the weight of the present day fall away. We are traveling back in time, across the ocean, and deep into the heart of southern Brazil. Imagine the year 1924. The air in the state of Rio Grande do Sul is heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Beneath your feet, the ground is a deep, bruised shade of crimson. This is the Terra Roxa, the famous purple-red soil of the region, a land that clings to everything it touches. In the heat of the afternoon, the dust rises in fine, velvet clouds, coating the leaves of the towering Araucaria pines and settling into the creases of worn leather boots. It is a frontier world, beautiful and wild, where the horizon feels endless and the silence of the forest is both a sanctuary and a warning. In 1924, the landscape of southern Brazil was not just a physical wilderness, but a political one. The echoes of the revolution of 1923 still vibrated through the valleys. It was a time of fierce loyalties and dangerous divisions, where men wore silk neckscarves of red or white to signal their allegiances. The atmosphere was charged with a quiet, static tension, like the moments before a summer thunderstorm. In the small, remote settlements, neighbors watched one another from shaded porches, and the sound of a distant horse galloping along a dirt track could cause a whole village to hold its breath. It was into this world of vibrant colors and sharp shadows that a man of peace arrived, carrying a heavy wooden cross and a heart full of Spanish fire. He was Father Manuel Gómez González, a man far from the rocky coasts of his birthplace in Spain, walking through the red dust of a new world that would eventually claim him. Father Manuel had been born in the year 1877 in the quiet hills of Tai, Spain. He was a man of the old world, a man who had been ordained in 1902 and had spent his early years breathing the salty air of the Atlantic. But the hand of Providence, or perhaps the winds of history, drew him away from the familiar stone churches of Galicia. By 1913, political and religious unrest in Portugal, where he had been serving, forced him to look toward the horizon. He crossed the vast, dark waters of the Atlantic, arriving in Brazil with little more than his faith and his devotion to the marginalized. After a short time in the bustling streets of Rio de Janeiro, he found himself sent to the far south, to the wild, northern reaches of Rio Grande do Sul. By December of 1915, he had reached the parish of Nanaue. It was a place so vast and isolated it felt like its own small universe, tucked away amidst the ancient forests and the rolling hills. Visualize the village of Nanaue as it appeared to him then. It was a tapestry of green and red. The forest was an impenetrable wall of cedar and laurel, home to the indigenous Kaingang people who had walked these paths for centuries. Father Manuel moved through this landscape not as a conqueror, but as a shepherd. He learned the rhythms of the frontier, the way the light filtered through the canopy in the early morning, and the way the red mud would thicken after a heavy rain, making every journey a test of endurance. He was a man of action, founding a school and building a sanctuary where there had been only wilderness. He spent 8 long years traveling on horseback, his black cassock slowly turning a rust red from the constant spray of the earth. He visited the sick in huts made of mud and straw, and he spoke of peace in a land where the rifle was often the final arbiter of any dispute. As the months of 1924 began to unfold, the shadows over the region grew longer. The political revolution had splintered the population into factions, and the roads became corridors of uncertainty. Armed groups, known as the Provisional Soldiers, roamed the backcountry, their presence a constant reminder that the law of the city did not reach the heart of the forest. Father Manuel remained steadfast, his blue eyes tired but clear. He was often warned by the local people, including the faithful Kaingang, that the paths were becoming too dangerous for a man of the church. They spoke of ambushes and of men who no longer respected the sanctity of the robe. But Manuel had a mission that transcended the borders of politics. He was a man who believed in the inherent dignity of every soul he met, whether they were humble farmers, indigenous tribes, or the very soldiers who patrolled the red dirt roads with cold iron in their hands. Beside him, during these final, dusty years, was a young boy who looked up at the priest with a quiet, steady devotion. Adílio Daronch was born in 1908, the son of Italian immigrants who had sought a new life in the fertile soil of Brazil. By the time he was 15 years old, he had become Father Manuel's shadow. Adílio was a child of the frontier, comfortable with the silence of the long rides and the heavy weight of the liturgical books he carried for his mentor. He was an altar boy, a student, and a companion. Together, the middle-aged Spaniard and the teenage Brazilian formed a bond forged in the crucible of the wild South. As we leave them tonight, imagine them preparing for one final journey. The horses are saddled, the red dust is settling in the evening cool, and the year 1924 is about to demand a price that neither of them could have foreseen. Rest now, and let the image of that winding red road fade into the dark. Adílio Daronch was born in 1908, specifically on October 25th, in the small town of Dona Francisca. His family, led by Pietro and Judite, were Italian immigrants seeking a better life in the verdant landscape of Rio Grande do Sul. By 1913, when Adílio was just 5 years old, they settled in Nanaue. This was a place of deep, red earth and towering pines, where the air smelled of wood smoke and forest humidity. The Daronch household was a bustling one, with Adílio being the third of 8 children. In the quiet hours of his youth, he could hear the rhythmic hammer of his father, Pietro, who worked as a shoemaker. It was a life of modest means, but profound faith. The church bells in the distance were the heartbeat of their community, drawing the boy toward a path of service. In 1915, a new presence arrived in Nanaue that would change Adílio's life forever. Father Manuel Gómez González, a Spanish priest with a firm resolve, was entrusted with the parish. He brought a rare energy, establishing a school and reaching out to the most isolated corners of the territory. For young Adílio, the priest was a bridge to a wider world. Manuel's voice, carrying the soft lilt of his Spanish homeland, filled the parish hall with stories of devotion. Adílio became a dedicated student in the priest's school, and soon he found himself drawn to the altar. He learned the precise movements of the liturgy, the way to fold the linens, the careful handling of the golden chalice, and the rhythmic swinging of the thurible. Under Manuel's guidance, the boy's faith began to take root. Despite his growing piety, Adílio remained a boy of his time. In the afternoons, when the heat of the Brazilian sun softened, he could often be found on the dusty outskirts of town, chasing a leather ball. His sister, Zulmira, would later recall his infectious love for football and his talent for writing. He moved with a grace that suggested a deep connection to the land. Whether he was galloping across the rolling hills or navigating the narrow paths on his donkey, Adílio possessed a quiet confidence. He was well-liked, a simple and religious child who found as much joy in a game as he did in the silence of prayer. This balance of spirit made him the perfect companion for Father Manuel, who saw in the boy a purity and a resilience that was rare even among the faithful. The year 1923 brought a heavy shadow to the Daronch doorstep. Adílio's father, Pietro, was taken from them, murdered in a senseless act that left the family fractured. In the wake of this tragedy, the bond between the teenage Adílio and Father Manuel deepened into something closer to father and son. The priest became a steady anchor in the boy's turbulent world. Adílio, now 15, found solace in his duties. He spent more time at the church, the smell of incense and old wax providing a sanctuary from the grief haunting his home. It was during this period that Manuel began to ask Adílio to accompany him on his long pastoral visits. These were not easy journeys. They required traveling for days through dense forests and over rugged mountains to reach remote settlements and the camps of the Kaingang people. The two made a striking pair on the trail, the aging priest and the slender, bright-eyed adolescent. They moved together with a shared rhythm, often in a comfortable silence broken only by the steady clip-clop of their mounts' hooves on the hard-packed earth. Father Manuel taught Adílio how to navigate the wilderness and how to speak to those living on the fringes of society with dignity. On these missions, the shadow of the altar was no longer just a metaphor. It was the literal shade provided by the makeshift structures where they would hold Mass under the canopy of the sky. Adílio handled the vestments with reverence, even when they were covered in the fine, red dust of the road. He was more than an assistant. He was a witness to the priest's unwavering commitment to a forgotten flock. As 1924 dawned, the air in Rio Grande do Sul thickened with tension. Political unrest was bubbling beneath the surface, and the remote forests were becoming home to revolutionary bands who viewed the church with suspicion. Father Manuel's messages of peace and mutual respect began to grate against the edges of local extremism. Yet, despite the warnings and the mounting danger, the priest and his young protege did not waver. They continued to plan their visits to the furthest outposts, fueled by a sense of duty that transcended their own safety. The bond they had forged in the quiet halls of Nanaue was about to be tested in the deepest shadows of the forest, where the line between service and sacrifice was beginning to blur into the red soil. They were stepping into a storm, guided by a faith that refused to seek shelter. The red dust of Nanaue settled slowly over the parish house, as the final echoes of the 1924 Holy Week celebrations faded into the humid afternoon air. Within the thick, whitewashed walls, Father Manuel Gómez González sat in a moment of rare stillness, the scent of spent incense still clinging to his heavy black cassock. He was a man of 46 years, a veteran of both the harsh Galician coasts of Spain and the political storms of Portugal, but Brazil had presented him with a different kind of challenge. His parish was not a simple village or a cluster of homes, but a sprawling, untamed wilderness that felt more like a kingdom than a territory. It was a landscape of deep green cathedrals and red mud veins that pulsed with the life of isolated settlers and indigenous tribes. Here, the spiritual hunger was as palpable as the damp heat, and Manuel knew that his duty often meant stepping far beyond the safety of the altar rail. Beside him, helping to fold the linens with a practiced, rhythmic grace, was Adílio Daronch. At 15 years old, the boy possessed a quiet gravity that belied his youth, a solemnity born from a childhood marked by the sudden violence of the frontier. His father had been taken by the unrest only a year prior, in 1923, leaving a void that Adílio had filled with devotion and service to the mission. He was more than an altar boy. He was a companion of the road, a student who understood the language of the horses and the shifting moods of the forest trails. Together, they looked like an unlikely pair, the seasoned priest with eyes that had seen empires fall, and the slender youth whose world was contained within the borders of Rio Grande do Sul. Yet a shared sense of purpose bound them as they prepared for a journey that many in the village whispered was a fool's errand. The political air outside was thin with suspicion, vibrating with the low-frequency hum of a revolution that had never truly ended. In the surrounding hills, the struggle between the Marigatos, recognized by their striking red neckerchiefs, and the Chimangos, who wore white, had turned the countryside into a patchwork of shifting loyalties and hidden dangers. The revolution of 1923 had left the borderlands scarred, and now, in the spring of 1924, the tension was rising once more. Armed bands of provisional soldiers and rebels moved through the undergrowth like ghosts, and the simple act of traveling between towns was seen as a political statement. To be a priest in such times was to walk a razor's edge, attempting to offer the peace of the sacraments to men who were more familiar with the cold weight of a rifle than the warmth of a prayer. A letter had arrived from the Bishop of Santa Maria, carrying a request that weighed heavily on Father Manuel's heart. Deep within the Tres Passos forest, a colony of Teutonic settlers had been left without a shepherd for months. These German-Brazilian families were living in a state of spiritual exile, their children unbaptized, and their dead buried without the final blessings of the Church. The bishop spoke of the urgent need for a visitation, for someone to brave the trails and bring the comfort of the liturgy to the heart of the wilderness. To Manuel, this was not just a clerical duty. It was a call from the very soul of his vocation. He could almost hear the silence of those remote chapels, the dust gathering on the small wooden altars, and the quiet desperation of parents waiting for the sign of the cross to be traced on their infants' foreheads. The local authorities and even the friendly Kaingang people had offered somber warnings. They spoke of the trails being watched, of men with hard eyes who did not distinguish between a man of God and a spy. The indigenous elders, who knew the secret rhythms of the leaves and the warning calls of the birds, sensed a darkness gathering in the dense canopy towards the north. They advised the priest to wait, to let the political storms blow over before venturing toward the military colonies and the settler outposts. But Manuel's resolve was like the ancient stone of his Spanish homeland. He believed that the grace of divine providence was a shield more reliable than any armed escort. He looked at Adílio and offered the boy a chance to stay behind, to remain in the relative sanctuary of Nanaue. But the youth simply tightened the straps on the saddlebags and shook his head. Their preparations were methodical and silent. They packed the essentials for the journey, a small supply of bread, dried meat, and the precious vessels of the Mass. Manuel carefully wrapped the holy oils and the silver chalice in soft cloth, tucking them deep into the leather pouches. He included his worn breviary, its pages thin as onion skin, and the vestments that would soon be stained with the sweat and dust of the trail. Adílio checked the horses, ensuring their shoes were firm and their spirits calm for the long ride ahead. There was a strange beauty in the mundanity of their packing, the soft clink of metal, the smell of oiled leather, and the steady breath of the animals. They were preparing to carry the light of their faith into a place where the shadows were growing long, and the rules of the civilized world no longer applied. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged horizon, casting long, violet fingers across the plains, the priest and the boy stood for a final moment on the steps of the church. The air was cooling now, filled with the scent of wet earth and night-blooming jasmine. Manuel raised his hand in a silent blessing over the town they were leaving behind, his heart filled with a mixture of apprehension and profound peace. They climbed into their saddles, the leather creaking under their weight, and turned their horses toward the dark, inviting line of the forest. The journey to Tres Passos had begun, and with every steady hoofbeat, they moved further away from the known world and deeper into the heart of the wilderness, where the call of duty and the whispers of danger were becoming one and the same. The violet fingers of the twilight slowly withdrew, leaving Father Manuel and young Adílio to the encroaching embrace of the dense Brazilian brush. The horses, their coats slick with the fine mist of the humid evening, stepped cautiously over the protruding roots of ancient trees. Every snap of a twig under a heavy hoof seemed to echo through the stillness of the Alto Uruguay. The transition from the open plains to the shadowed interior was abrupt, a threshold marked by the heavy scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. Here, the canopy above was so thick that the first stars of the evening could not penetrate the darkness. Father Manuel adjusted the reins, his fingers grazing the rough leather that had become a familiar companion during his decade of service in this vast, untamed land. Beside him, the 16-year-old boy, Adílio, rode with a quiet dignity that belied his youthful age. He did not complain of the cooling air or the biting insects that danced in the shadows. He simply watched the trail, his eyes reflecting the deep, obsidian green of the foliage as they moved further from the safety of the mission. But the stillness of the forest was a mask, a fragile veil over a landscape fractured by the remnants of the revolution of 1923. The wounds of the conflict between the Chimangos and the Marigatos were still fresh, bleeding into the very soil they traversed. In every small settlement and hidden clearing, the colors of a man's scarf could mean the difference between a warm welcome and a violent end. The red of the revolutionaries and the white of the government forces were more than just fabric. They were declarations of intent that had turned neighbor against neighbor across the state of Rio Grande do Sul. As they rode deeper into the woods, the political atmosphere felt as heavy as the humidity. Father Manuel knew that his presence as a priest was often seen through a distorted lens. To some, he was a bridge to the divine, a man who brought comfort to the isolated. To others, he was a figure of authority that represented a status quo they sought to dismantle with fire and lead. The revolutionary forces, wandering through these same thickets, were restless, their hearts hardened by years of guerrilla warfare and the bitter, metallic taste of perceived injustice. They were traveling toward the military colony, a journey prompted by a letter from the Bishop of Santa Maria. There were soldiers there who had not seen a priest in many months, men who sought the peace of the Easter sacraments in a time of deep unrest. Father Manuel felt the weight of his mission in the rhythmic swaying of his horse. He thought of the German colonists waiting in Tres Passos, families who had carved a life out of this wilderness and now waited for the blessing of their cemetery and the baptism of their children. The forest seemed to lean in as he pondered these duties, the towering araucaria trees standing like silent, jagged sentinels against the darkening sky. These prehistoric giants, with their umbrella-like crowns, cast long, distorted shadows that merged with the undergrowth, creating a labyrinth of gray and black. Adílio reached out to brush a low-hanging fern, the soft fronds leaving a trail of moisture on his skin. The boy was a child of this land, born to Italian immigrants who had sought a new life in 1908, yet even he felt the shifting energy of the woods tonight. The whispers began as the light failed completely. They were not voices, but the unsettling sounds of a forest that felt watched. The distant, mournful call of the macuco bird drifted through the trees, a lonely whistle that seemed to signal their arrival to unseen eyes. The wind moved through the upper branches with a low, rushing sound like the breath of a sleeping giant, but on the forest floor, the air was stagnant and thick. Every rustle in the dry brush could be a small animal, or it could be a scout for one of the rebel bands that occupied the region. These men, fueled by the revolutionary fervor of the 1920s, often viewed the clergy with suspicion, seeing the church as an ally of the powerful government they fought against. Father Manuel had been warned of the dangers, told that the paths were no longer safe for a man of the cloth and a young boy, yet he had pressed on. His faith was a shield, or perhaps a blindfold, preventing him from seeing the true depth of the resentment brewing in the shadows of the palms. As the horses slowed to a walk to navigate a particularly steep ravine, the sound of rushing water rose to meet them. A small stream, swollen by recent rains, cut through the rocks, its surface shimmering like liquid silver where the moonlight managed to find a gap. They paused briefly to allow the animals to drink, the splashing sound dangerously loud in the oppressive quiet. Father Manuel looked at Adílio, seeing the boy's silhouette against the pale water. There was an unspoken bond between them, a shared understanding of the risks they took for the sake of their faith. The boy had been a student in the school the priest had founded, a faithful assistant at the altar who had grown into a brave companion on these long, exhausting pastoral visits. They were miles from Nanaue now, far from the familiar bells of the parish and the safety of their wooden rectory. In this wilderness, the only law was the one carried at the hip of a revolutionary or the end of a soldier's rifle. The political tensions of Brazil in 1924 were not confined to the cities. They seeped into the very roots of the forest, turning every trail into a potential ambush. The path ahead grew narrower, the brush clawing at the priest's cassock and the boy's simple clothes. They were entering the heart of the region known as Feijão Miúdo, a place where the geography was as rugged as the men who hid within it. The forest here did not just whisper. It seemed to breathe with a heavy, rhythmic intensity. The air grew colder, and a thin fog began to coil around the trunks of the trees, blurring the edges of the world. Father Manuel whispered a quiet prayer, the Latin words falling softly into the darkness. He prayed for the peace of the nation, for the end of the bloodshed between brothers, and for the safety of the young soul at his side. But even as he spoke the words, the feeling of being followed intensified. It was a prickle on the back of the neck, a sense that the shadows were moving out of sync with the wind. The revolution was no longer a distant rumor heard in the marketplace. It was here, in the cold mist and the snapping branches, waiting for the morning to reveal its face. They moved forward, two small figures in a vast, emerald sea of uncertainty, as the forest continued its restless, ghostly whispering. The air in the settlement of Feijão Miúdo hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sweet, decaying fragrance of the surrounding woodland. It was the afternoon of May 21st, 1924, and the humid warmth of the Brazilian interior seemed to press against the skin like a physical weight. Father Manuel and young Adílio had arrived at this small cluster of wooden homes after a journey that had tested their endurance. Yet their faces showed no signs of the weariness that must have settled deep within their bones. Here, amongst the scattered families and the quiet rustle of the leaves, they found a community waiting for spiritual solace. The houses were humble, constructed from hand-hewn timber and topped with thatch that had silvered under the relentless sun. As the priest dismounted, his dark cassock was coated in a fine layer of ochre dust, a silent testament to the miles of unpaved road they had traversed to reach this remote corner of Rio Grande do Sul. In a small clearing shaded by the sweeping branches of ancient trees, Father Manuel began what would be his final acts of ministry. A simple ceramic bowl was filled with cool water from a nearby spring, and the locals gathered in a hushed semicircle. There were infants to be baptized, their small cries punctuating the rhythmic chanting of the Latin prayers. Manuel's voice was a soft baritone, steady and reassuring as he traced the sign of the cross on tiny foreheads. Adílio stood by his side, the 16-year-old boy moving with a grace that belied his age. He held the ceremonial items with a reverence that showed his deep commitment to the man he followed. Each drop of water that fell seemed to hold a profound significance in the stillness of the afternoon. The families watched with eyes full of hope, unaware that the peace of this ritual was a fragile veil drawn over a landscape brewing with violent intent. As the final baptism concluded, and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep oranges, a local farmer approached the priest. He pulled Manuel aside, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper that carried the sharp edge of genuine fear. The man spoke of shadows moving through the brush and the glint of steel seen on the road ahead. He warned them that the remnants of the 1923 revolution were still active in the area, and that bands of armed men, desperate and unpredictable, had been spotted near the pass. "Do not go further tonight, Father," the man pleaded, his eyes darting toward the dense tree line. "The road is no longer safe for men of peace. There are those who see a collar and a cross not as a sign of God, but as a target for their frustration." The warning was clear and heavy with the weight of local knowledge, a desperate attempt to keep the travelers within the relative safety of the village walls. Father Manuel listened with a calm that unsettled those around him. He looked at Adílio, who remained steadfast, his youthful face reflecting the same quiet resolve as his mentor. The priest understood the political turmoil that had gripped the region, the bitter divisions between the various factions that had turned neighbors against one another. But to Manuel, his mission was not political. It was a divine mandate that could not be paused by the threat of earthly violence. He thanked the farmer for his kindness, his hand resting briefly on the man's shoulder in a gesture of gratitude. "My path is set," he whispered, more to himself than to the crowd. He believed that his duty to reach the indigenous communities and the settlers further down the trail outweighed the shadows lurking in the forest. It was a decision born of a profound, perhaps even dangerous, faith, a belief that the mantle of his office would provide a shield, or that if it did not, he was prepared for the sacrifice. The shadows grew long and spindly as they prepared to depart. The villagers watched in a somber silence, the air thick with an unspoken dread that seemed to vibrate through the trees. Adílio tightened the cinches on the horses, his movements methodical and calm, despite the warnings that still echoed in the cooling air. As they climbed back into their saddles, the metallic click of the stirrups sounded unusually loud in the quiet of the clearing. They turned their horses toward the narrow trail that led into the heart of the dense woodland, away from the flickering hearth fires of Feijão Miúdo. The dust kicked up by the hooves hung suspended in the golden shafts of dying light, creating a shimmering curtain that slowly hid them from view. With every step away from the settlement, the forest seemed to lean in closer, the canopy overhead weaving together to block out the stars. They rode forward into the deepening indigo of the twilight, the warnings of the locals lingering behind them like a ghost, while the road ahead vanished into an impenetrable, silent dark. The path from Nanoe was a narrow ribbon of churned earth and tangled roots snaking through the wilderness. On this Wednesday, the 21st of May, 1924, the air hung heavy with the humidity of the southern Brazilian autumn, pressing down with a weight that felt almost physical. Manuel Gómez González sat upon his mule, his posture weary but resolute, his hands holding the reins as the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves against the damp soil acted as a metronome for his prayers. Beside him, young Adílio Daronch, only 15 years of age, moved with the quiet grace of youth, his eyes scanning the dense foliage of the towering Araucaria pines. They reached a small trading post, a lonely cluster of wooden buildings where the air smelled of dry grain and old leather. It was here they encountered the soldiers, men in tattered uniforms who spoke with a deceptive kindness, offering to guide them safely through the treacherous woods. The journey continued, but the initial relief of finding companions curdled into a slow, creeping dread. The soldiers did not speak of faith or their mission, but moved with a cold, predatory precision that made the forest feel smaller and more enclosed. As they neared the area known as Feijão Miúdo, the shadows stretched from the undergrowth like grasping hands. The mules, sensitive to the shifting energy, began to pull nervously against the reins. Manuel tightened his grip, whispering words of comfort to his animal, but his own heart beat with a quickened, hollow thud. The forest here was a labyrinth of emerald and brown, where the sunlight struggled to penetrate the interlocking ferns. Adílio looked toward the priest, seeking a sign of reassurance, but Manuel's eyes were fixed on the sharp bend in the trail ahead, where the soldiers began to veer away from the main path. The sound of their movement, the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves, seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive, waiting quiet of the afternoon. The soldiers finally brought them to a remote plateau, a high, lonely stretch of land where the trees grew thick and the wind carried the scent of distant rain. The deceptive kindness vanished like mist in the morning sun. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the metallic click of a rifle bolt, a sound that resonated with chilling clarity through the clearing. From the shadows, more figures emerged, their faces etched with the suspicion of the 1924 revolution. One soldier, his eyes narrowed, stepped forward to seize the mules. Manuel pulled his animal to a halt, his hands held visible and open in a gesture of peace. But the soldiers were already reaching for the heavy, rough-hewn ropes they had prepared for this very moment. The encounter was no longer a conversation. It was a series of sharp, barked commands. The soldiers led Manuel and Adílio toward two ancient, thick-trunked trees at the edge of the clearing. The physical sensation of the rough bark against their backs was a cold, jarring reality. The soldiers began to bind them, the rope biting into their wrists and ankles with a clinical efficiency. Manuel could feel the vibration of the tree through his spine, a silent witness to the unfolding tragedy. Adílio stayed close to the priest's spirit, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the coarse fibers of the rope were pulled tight against his young frame. The smell of the forest, the damp moss, the stagnant water trapped in the roots, and the pungent scent of pine needles seemed to intensify, anchoring them to this final, terrifying moment in the heart of the wild. They were brought to the edge of the clearing, where the trees revealed a patch of the pale, indifferent sky. The soldiers formed a menacing semicircle, their weapons held with a terrifying familiarity. Manuel knew then that the end of their journey was near. He turned his head toward Adílio as much as the ropes would allow, seeing the raw fear in the boy's eyes, and began to speak the words of a final blessing. The priest's voice was unwavering, a low, melodic contrast to the environment, as he offered absolution to the child, and perhaps even to the men standing before them. The soldiers did not wait. The order was given, a short, sharp sound that cut through the air. The first volley of gunshots exploded with a violence that ripped the fabric of the forest apart, the sound echoing off the massive trunks and bouncing back in a chaotic roar. As the smoke cleared, the violence gave way to a stillness more profound than before. The soldiers looked down at the two figures lying still against the base of the trees, their work finished with a cold, political finality. There was no triumph, only the hollow stare of men who had lost their way in the fog of war. They turned and disappeared into the shadows, their footsteps fading until only the natural sounds of the woods remained. The insects resumed their song, a low buzzing that filled the clearing. The golden fingers of sunlight retracted as the sun dipped lower, leaving the bodies of Manuel and Adílio in the cool, deepening shade. The echoes had faded entirely now, leaving only the soft, mournful sighing of the wind as it moved through the high, dark branches of the ancient pines. The echoes of the rifle shots did not travel far in the dense embrace of the Tres Passos forest. The canopy, woven from the branches of ancient pines and giants, seemed to swallow the sound, holding it close to the damp earth. When the soldiers finally turned their horses and retreated, a heavy stillness descended upon the clearing known as Fay Jau Miudo. It was a silence that carried the weight of what had just transpired, a sudden, violent rupture in the peace of the wilderness. For hours, the only movement came from the slow swaying of the ferns and the occasional flutter of a bird returning to its nest, wary of the scent hanging in the humid air. The sun, dipping lower on that afternoon of May 21st, 1924, cast long shadows across the floor, painting the scene in amber. The two figures remained exactly where the violence had left them, tethered to the rough bark of two neighboring trees. Manuel, the priest who had traveled leagues to bring comfort to the colonies, sat slumped against the trunk, his clerical garments stained and torn. Beside him, young Adílio, only 15 years of age, looked almost as if he were asleep, his head tilted toward his shoulder. There was a profound, tragic dignity in their posture, even in the wake of such cruelty. Around them, the forest continued its slow cycles. A few loose pages from a prayer book had fluttered into the brush, their edges curling in the moisture. The wooden cross that Manuel had carried was partially obscured by the mist, yet it stood as a silent witness. The ground beneath them had drunk deeply, marking the spot forever. In the nearby settlement, a community of German immigrants and local workers waited with a growing sense of unease. They had been expecting the priest's arrival, preparing their humble homes for the blessing of a visit. As the hours stretched into a full day, and then two, the initial patience of the colonists curdled into a cold fear. They knew the political tensions of the region were at a boiling point. They knew the revolutionary movements had made the forest trails a landscape of peril. Yet, Manuel was a man of peace, and Adílio a mere boy. It seemed unthinkable that the violence of men would claim those who traveled only with words of grace. Groups of men began to gather, until finally, on the morning of May 25th, a search party was organized to retrace the path. The searchers moved through the undergrowth with a heavy caution, their machetes clearing away the vines that choked the narrow trail. The air in the deep woods was cool and smelled of rot and new growth, a paradox of life and death that defined the Brazilian interior. As they crested a small plateau, the lead searcher came to a sudden, jarring halt. The others pressed forward, their breath catching in their chests as they broke through the final screen of foliage into the clearing. The light of the morning sun was filtering down in narrow, golden shafts, illuminating the two trees that had become a makeshift scaffold. There was no need for a shout. The stillness of the scene spoke with a finality that chilled the blood. They found themselves standing at the edge of a sanctuary. The local residents approached the bodies with a reverence that surpassed simple mourning. They saw the ropes that bound the priest and the acolyte, the marks of the struggle, and the peaceful expressions that remained on their faces despite the ordeal. One farmer, his hands calloused from years of tilling the soil, knelt in the dirt and made the sign of the cross, his tears falling onto the ground that had held the martyrs for 4 days. They noticed how the two had fallen, together, in a shared fate that mirrored their journey. The items they had carried, the small tokens of their faith, were gathered up with trembling fingers. There was an unspoken understanding. This spot in the woods was no longer just a place of death. It had become a cornerstone of their history, a site of sacrifice. The task of moving the fallen back to the settlement was a slow and somber procession. They fashioned litters from the branches of the trees that had witnessed the end, laying Manuel and Adílio upon beds of green leaves. As the small group began the trek back, the news seemed to ripple through the forest, carried by the wind and the hushed whispers of those they met. The story of the priest and the boy who refused to turn back was already taking shape in the hearts of the people. Behind them, the clearing at Feijão Miúdo returned to its natural state, the disturbed earth remaining as evidence. Yet, for those who had seen them there, the image of the two would be burned into their memories, a testament that the shadows of the forest could never fully conceal. The year was 1924, and the vast, undulating landscapes of Rio Grande do Sul were no longer the peaceful pastures of memory. Instead, they had become a fractured stage for what many would later call the trial of the revolution. It was a time when the legalities of the city felt 1,000 miles away, and the only law that held weight was the weight of the rifle and the authority of the revolutionary column. As the bodies of Manuel and Adílio were recovered, and the initial shock began to settle into a cold, hard grief, a different kind of investigation began. It was not an investigation held in a courtroom with polished wood and stacks of paper, but one born in the whispers of the forest and the fearful testimonies of the local settlers who had seen the men in uniform passing through the shadows. The political climate was a suffocating mist. The tenentist movement, driven by junior military officers, sought to upend the old oligarchies, but in the process, the lines between liberation and lawlessness had blurred into a dark, indistinguishable smear. The identity of the attackers remained, for a time, a ghost story told by those too frightened to speak the names aloud. Witnesses described the men as part of the revolutionary vanguard, soldiers who had cast off their allegiance to the federal government, but kept the discipline and the cold efficiency of their training. These were men who moved with a singular, grim purpose, their boots caked in the thick, red clay of the region, their eyes hardened by months of skirmishing in the brush. To them, the presence of a Spanish priest like Manuel was not just a religious matter, but a political threat. The investigation revealed that the rebels viewed the church's influence as an anchor to the old world they were trying to burn away. Manuel, with his insistence on burying the victims of previous skirmishes with Christian dignity, had inadvertently marked himself as a man who chose sides, even if the side he chose was simply that of the suffering. In the eyes of the Revolutionary Command, providing a proper burial for a fallen enemy was seen as an act of defiance against the revolution itself. The chaotic atmosphere of May 1924 meant that justice was a phantom. The revolutionary bands operated with a horizontal structure that made pinpointing a single commanding officer nearly impossible. However, as the church began to gather its own record of the events, a chilling picture of the ambush emerged. The soldiers who had offered to escort Manuel and Adílio into the forest were not mere stragglers. They were part of a coordinated effort to silence a voice of peace that was beginning to resonate too loudly among the German and Italian settlers of Tres Passos. These investigators, working in the wake of the violence, found that the attackers had been fueled by a specific brand of anti-clerical radicalism that had permeated the revolutionary ranks. They saw the cassock as a uniform of the elite, and the young boy, Adílio, as nothing more than an unfortunate witness who had to be removed to ensure the silence of the trees remained unbroken. The trial of the revolution was, in essence, a series of summary executions carried out under the guise of military necessity. As we look deeper into the documents from that era, we find that the search for the perpetrators was hampered by the constant shifting of the front lines. One day, a town would be under the control of the revolutionaries. The next, the loyalist government forces would sweep through, leaving a trail of fire and further confusion. Amidst this upheaval, the specific identities of the firing squad were buried under the names of brigades and divisions. Yet the local memory was long. They remembered the faces of the men who had stopped at the Emporium to ask the way, the men who had smiled with a hollow kindness before leading the priest and the boy into the depths of the green canopy. The investigation eventually pointed toward a group of extremist rebels who had become disillusioned with the slow pace of the uprising and had turned toward a more brutal, scorched-earth policy. For them, killing a priest was a way to prove their commitment to a new, secular order, a chilling demonstration that no one was beyond the reach of their revolutionary justice. The targeting of the clergy was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a much larger infection of violence that had taken hold of the Brazilian interior. The investigation into Manuel's death became a mirror for the entire nation's struggle. How could a man of God, whose only weapon was a rosary and a prayer book, be seen as a combatant? The answer lay in the radicalized minds of his executioners, who believed that anyone not explicitly for the revolution was an obstacle that needed to be cleared. The sheer scale of the chaos meant that for decades, no formal trial ever took place in a state-sanctioned court. The murderers simply melted back into the civilian population or died in subsequent battles, their names fading into the general roar of the war. But the trial of the revolution continued in the hearts of the faithful, where the evidence was not found in ballistics, but in the enduring spirit of the victims and the refusal of the community to let the crime be forgotten in the mud of 1924. In the final accounting of this chapter of history, we see that the lack of a traditional trial only added to the weight of the tragedy. The investigation was forced to rely on the scars left on the landscape, the 2 trees where they were bound, the spent casings found in the dirt, and the unwavering silence of the forest that seemed to hold its breath for years afterward. The political climate of the time demanded blood to prove loyalty, and Manuel and Adílio became the unintended sacrifices of a movement that had lost its moral compass. As the sun set on the investigation of 1924, the truth remained tethered to those trees, waiting for a future generation to uncover the layers of political rage and find the human faces beneath the revolutionary masks. The identity of the attackers was eventually woven into the broader tapestry of the civil unrest. But for the people of Nanaue and Tres Passos, the trial was never about finding a name, but about understanding how such a darkness could ever have been allowed to bloom in their own backyard. The echoes of the rifle shots had dissolved into the dense canopy of the Rio Grande do Sul forest, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. On that hill in Feijão Miúdo, the shadows stretched long across the red earth as the sun set on the evening of May 21st, 1924. Tied to two separate trees were the earthly remains of Father Manuel and young Adílio. The priest, 47 years of age, and his faithful altar server, who had not yet reached 16, were left to the whims of the wild. The revolutionaries who had orchestrated the ambush disappeared into the brush, believing they had silenced a nuisance. But as the first night fell over the plateau, the forest began a different kind of vigil, one that would transform this remote patch of wilderness into a site of profound holiness. For 4 days, the world seemed to hold its breath. In the humid heat of the Brazilian autumn, one might have expected the elements or the creatures of the woods to claim what was left behind. Yet the accounts from those who eventually arrived speak of a quiet miracle. Despite the presence of jaguars and scavenging birds that haunted these thickets, not a single animal approached the two figures. They remained exactly as they had fallen, their features preserved in a state of unnatural peace. The local flora, the ferns and the towering trees, seemed to offer a protective shroud. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss, and the only sound was the rhythmic drip of condensation. It was as if time itself had slowed down, refusing to let the decay of the world touch those who had died for their faith. On the morning of May 25th, the silence was broken by the sound of voices. The inhabitants of Tres Passos, concerned by the long absence of the priest and his young companion, had ventured into the deep green labyrinth to find them. When they finally reached the plateau, they found the two martyrs still tied to their posts. The sight was one of profound sorrow, but also of strange beauty. The colonists knelt in the dirt, their prayers rising like incense through the pillars of the trees. They saw the bullet wounds, 2 in the priest and 3 in the boy, and they saw the lack of any predation. In this moment, as the first tears hit the soil, the ground was no longer just a place of execution. It was becoming a destination for the broken-hearted seeking a small piece of the divine. The initial burial was a modest affair, born of necessity and reverence. Because they were far from the consecrated grounds of a churchyard, the locals prepared a resting place nearby, perhaps in the very cemetery the priest had intended to bless. They dug into the iron-colored soil, a earth so vibrant it looked like spilled wine. Each shovel of dirt was an act of mourning. They laid Father Manuel and Adílio into the ground together, side by side, under the watchful eyes of the same trees that had witnessed their final moments. The wooden crosses they erected were simple, fashioned from the surrounding timber, yet they stood as the first markers of a sanctuary that would soon draw thousands into the heart of the wild. The red earth closed over them, beginning a long and silent sleep that would last for many decades. In the weeks that followed, the path to Feijão Miúdo did not grow over with weeds. It was kept clear by the constant footfalls of the faithful. At first, it was just the local farmers, coming to light a single candle or leave wildflowers at the base of the crosses. They spoke of a lingering presence, a sense of calm that permeated the air. People began to bring their troubles to the site, whispering their secrets into the wind. They came seeking comfort for their own losses, finding a kinship with the priest and the boy who had been buried in the wild. The tragedy was being rewoven into a narrative of hope. The sound of shifting leaves replaced the sound of the rifle, and the forest became a cathedral for the poor and the forgotten. This remote burial ground would remain their home for 40 years. Through the changing seasons and the shifting political tides, the bodies of Manuel and Adílio stayed cradled in the red earth. The forest grew around them, but the memory of what happened there only became more vivid. The simple crosses gave way to permanent markers, but the essence of the pilgrimage remained the same. It was a journey into the quiet to find something holy. Even before the exhumation in 1964, the people knew that this soil was different. They were the keepers of the story, ensuring the names of the martyrs would never be forgotten. As the sun set, the plateau remained a silent witness to a devotion that refused to fade, a light burning in the dark. The years did not merely pass. They settled like fine silt over the red earth of Rio Grande do Sul. For a long time, the story of Manuel and Adílio existed in the hushed tones of candlelight and shared memories. In the 4 decades following 1924, the forest around the clearing known as Fera des Seat grew thick, as if the trees were guarding the secret of what had occurred beneath their canopy. But memory is a persistent thing. It does not always fade. Sometimes it burns brighter as the shadows lengthen. In the small towns, the names of the priest and his acolyte were whispered by mothers to their children, weaving a tapestry of sanctity that the political winds could not tear down. Their legacy remained rooted in the soil, waiting for the moment to be fully revealed. By the arrival of the 1960s, a quiet urgency began to take hold. The children who had watched Manuel Gómez González celebrate Mass were now elders, their faces etched with the lines of time. There was a realization that the living library of their experiences was nearing its final chapters. If the world was to ever truly understand the sacrifice of the Spanish priest and the brave 16-year-old boy, their voices had to be captured. In 1964, the community moved the remains of the martyrs to a place of honor, but the physical translation of their bones was only part of the journey. The real work lay in the gathering of the intangible, the testimonies that would form the backbone of a legacy. These were the moments when the community chose to stand against the forgetting of history. Imagine a small, sun-drenched room in a parish house, where the air is heavy with the scent of old paper. An elderly woman sits across from a priest who holds a pen poised over a ledger. She closes her eyes, and the year is 1924 again. She describes the way Father Manuel's voice sounded when he spoke of peace, a gentle melody that steadied the hearts of the anxious colonists. She recalls the sight of Adílio, his youthful face bright with a devotion that seemed far beyond his years. These sessions were sacred. Every detail, the dust on their boots, the specific tone of the priest's final blessing, was recorded with a reverence that transformed simple facts into a spiritual inheritance. The scratching of the pen on the page was the sound of a miracle taking shape. The investigators who came to the region were struck by the consistency of these accounts. Even after 60 years, the witnesses did not waver. They spoke of the 2 martyrs as if they had only just stepped out of the room. This was the miracle of memory that preserved their essence. In the remote corners of the countryside, where life was dictated by the seasons, the story had been kept with crystalline clarity. The people remembered the exact location of the 2 trees where the pair had been bound. They remembered the heavy silence that followed the gunshots, a silence that seemed to have never truly left the plateau. The physical landscape had become a map of their martyrdom, where every hill and stream held a fragment of the story, waiting to be read by those who sought the truth. As the formal inquiry progressed, the volume of evidence grew into a mountain of faith. Hundreds of people came forward, some traveling for days on horseback, just to add their few sentences to the record. They spoke of a profound peace that settled over the valley after the deaths, and of the way the site of the murders had become a place of spontaneous pilgrimage. The investigators found that the devotion was a grassroots fire that had been smoldering in the hearts of the people for nearly a century. The gathering of these testimonies was a slow, deliberate process, mirroring the patient pace of the rural life they were documenting. Each written word was a brick in the monument being built to honor the man and the boy. The collective voice of the people became an unbreakable shield, against the passage of time. By the time the process moved toward its culmination, the miracle of memory had achieved its goal. The story of Manuel and Adílio was no longer confined to local folklore. It had become a testament of universal resonance. Those who had fought to keep the narrative alive could finally see the light of recognition shining upon the martyrs. The red earth had given up its secrets, and the voices of the elders had been woven into the eternal record of the faith. As the sun set over the hills of Rio Grande do Sul, the legacy of the priest from Spain and the boy from the mission stood as a bridge between the past and the present. It was a reminder that some truths are too vibrant to ever be forgotten, remaining alive in the hearts of those who remember. The passage of nearly a century has a way of softening the sharp edges of grief, turning a tragic memory into a steady, glowing ember of hope. For the people of the northern regions of Rio Grande do Sul, the story of the Spanish priest and his young acolyte never truly faded into the background of history. Instead, it lived in the quiet prayers of the elderly and the wide-eyed wonder of children hearing about the brave pair for the very first time. By the time the calendar turned to the 21st of October in the year 2007, the local devotion had grown into a global recognition. On that bright morning in Frederico, Westphalen, the air felt different. It was thick with a sense of arrival, a feeling that a long journey through the shadows of the forest was finally reaching its luminous conclusion. Over 40,000 people gathered, a sea of faithful souls stretching across the park, their voices rising in a soft, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate through the very earth where Manuel and Adílio had once walked. Cardinal José Saraiva Martins, acting on behalf of Pope Benedict XVI, stood before the multitude to read the official decree of beatification. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of the Vatican's careful investigation into the events of May 1924. When he spoke the names of Manuel Gómez González and Adílio Daronch, a profound silence fell over the crowd. In that moment, the political violence of the past century seemed to dissolve. The recognition of their martyrdom was not just a religious milestone, it was a healing of a collective wound. The Church formally acknowledged that they had died in hatred of the faith, but to those standing in the sun that day, they had lived in the abundance of love. The red vestments of the clergy, usually a symbol of blood, felt more like a celebration of the vibrant life that springs from sacrifice. The ceremony marked them forever as the martyrs of the North, pillars of faith for a region that had once been defined by its volatile borders and revolutionary unrest. If you were to visit the site of their sacrifice today, in the remote area known as Feijão Miúdo near Tres Passos, you would find a sanctuary that breathes with the spirit of peace. The path leading to the memorial, often called the Trail of the Martyrs, is a place where the modern world feels incredibly distant. The sunlight filters through the dense canopy of trees in long, golden shafts, illuminating the moss-covered stones and the delicate ferns that line the way. There is a specific kind of silence here, not an empty silence, but one filled with the rustling of leaves and the distant, melodic call of birds. It is easy to imagine the two of them there, perhaps stopping to rest under the very same species of trees that would eventually witness their final moments. The monument that now stands where they were bound is modest, reflecting the humility of the priest and the simple devotion of the 16-year-old boy who refused to leave his side. It is a place where pilgrims come to leave small tokens of gratitude, their whispers lost in the gentle breeze that constantly moves through the valley. The legacy of Manuel and Adílio has transformed the identity of the entire region. They are no longer just figures from a dark chapter of Brazilian history. They are the patrons of a peace that was hard-won. In 2012, Adílio was named the patron of the Diocese of Frederico, Westphalen, and a year later, he was recognized as a co-patron for World Youth Day in Rio de Janeiro, standing as an example of youthful courage for millions of people around the globe. Their story provides a bridge between different cultures. A Spanish missionary and a Brazilian boy of Italian descent, united in a common purpose. This unity has become a cornerstone for the local communities, who see in the martyrs a reason to choose dialogue over conflict and compassion over suspicion. The martyrs of the North have become a symbol of what it means to stand firm in one's convictions without ever resorting to the violence that claimed their lives. As the sun sets over the rolling hills of Nanaue and the shadows deepen in the forests of Tres Passos, the memory of Manuel and Adílio remains a constant, soothing presence. Their story reminds us that even the most violent acts of the past can be reclaimed and repurposed for the sake of peace. The tension of the 1920s has been replaced by the steady rhythm of a community that looks to the future with a sense of grace. We can almost hear the soft clatter of their mules on the dusty road, a sound that no longer heralds tragedy, but echoes the enduring nature of a life lived for others. The lights in the small chapels of the north flicker in the evening air, each flame a testament to a story that refused to be forgotten. The investigation into their journey, from the hills of Spain to the wild frontiers of Brazil, concludes here. We have walked with them through the heat of the day and the uncertainty of the revolutionary night. We have seen the power of a memory to outlast the bullets of an ambush and the strength of a young boy's loyalty to a mentor. Their lives were short, but their reach is eternal, touching every soul that seeks a moment of quiet reflection in a noisy world. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.